So there's a very good chance that even if your game isn't a shooter, there's shooting in it. It's just one of the most predominant elements of action games. Unless you're doing something that is strictly fantasy or strictly melee based, you're probably going to have some form of shooting. Hell, even if you're fantasy, you're probably going to have some form of bow and arrow or crossbow. Shooting is almost an inevitability in an action game. And one of the biggest parts about shooting in a game is how you aim. Now, I can think of 4 main ways that shooting, or at least aiming, can be done in a game. You have iron sights, you have reticles, you have auto aims or lock-ons, and then you have lasers. Today I'm Pliskin, and I want to talk about these 4 different means of aiming, how they coexist, how they work independently, which is better, some examples of good, some examples of bad, and just take a look at how aiming can affect your game's balancing and the overall experience of shooting in your action game. The first one I want to talk about is iron sights. Now, iron sights is the most in line with reality. That's, how you aim a gun in real life. You line up your iron sights, the rear sight, the front sight, and then you take your shot. Of course, when I say iron sights, I'm also going to include like red dots and weird kind of optics, everything that isn't quite yet a scope. Just that kind of, you're aiming, you still have your peripheral vision, sort of, and you're firing at targets at mid to close range. Now, usually the way that games handle iron sights is that you have to really kind of close yourself in. You lose a lot of your awareness and you move a lot slower. However, your weapon becomes a lot more accurate. This is good for when you're controlling recoil. This is good for when you're trying to shoot just a little bit further. Or if you're playing a game where you have to really focus on where exactly you're hitting your enemy, this is really useful. Of course, I start to think of Call of Duty, Far Cry, a lot of mainstream first-person shooters. This is the way that they tend to go. Then, of course, we have reticles. Now, reticles are where you have a little kind of heads-up display when you're playing the actual game, and that marks where your gun is going to be firing. So your guy is basically hip firing, but you can see where the bullets are going. Call of Duty and Far Cry use this as well, but it's a little bit kind of superfluous. Like in Call of Duty and Far Cry, if you disable the reticle, if you play COD on hardcore, or when I play Far Cry I turn off the reticle, the game works just as well, because the reticles in those games are incredibly inaccurate outside of point blank range anyways, and you're going to be spending the majority of your time in your iron sights. A much better example of a game that uses reticles, or actually 3 games that use reticles, are my 3 favorite first-person shooters: Halo Combat Evolved, Left 4 Dead 2, and Resident Evil 8. In all of these games, you're either in a scope or you're using your reticle to aim your gun. Some of them let you zoom in a little bit, but it's still focused on that reticle. You're never really going into those iron sights. I tend to like this better for first-person shooter, especially one that's very mobility and action oriented than using iron sights, because with this you're always on the move, you're always aware of everything that you're dealing with on the fight, and you don't have to have the same disadvantages as using your iron sights. So to explain what I mean by this and why I prefer this, let's take a look at Halo 1 and then let's take a look at something like Call of Duty. So in Halo 1, with every single weapon, there is a different style of reticle. If you're not scoped in, you see the reticle light up red, and that means you're going to be hitting this. Now, some weapons still have their spread. So for example, with the assault rifle, the reticle is there, but I know there's going to be a little bit of deviation because this is a spray and pray kind of weapon, right? Versus when I'm using the plasma rifle, the reticle is a little bit tighter because this is a much more accurate weapon sort of thing. So the reticle communicates a lot of what I need to know about the weapon and its application. But with both of these guns, I'm never really out of the fight. I could be shooting, but while I'm shooting, I'm jumping, I'm moving, I'm aware. I can see what color elite is there, I can see how many grunts are there. So while I'm using the weapon, I'm still thinking about my next move, right? And I feel like there's a lot more of a game involved in that than in something like Call of Duty, where I'm using my gun and I go into my iron sights because I want to make sure I get those headshots on zombies on later rounds, right? But as I'm in my iron sights, I have to stop running around. So this creates kind of a loop where I run to get some distance between me and the zombies, then I have to stop and do my damage, then I keep on running. Because as soon as I'm in those iron sights, that awareness, that ability to think of the next step kind of goes out of the window. Now, for a game mode like Zombies, I think this is pretty well balanced. It's very much like Resident Evil 4, which we're going to be talking about in a second, where it's that kind of almost a tower defense game where you're constantly repositioning, holding a stationary position, and then repositioning again to find your next stationary position. But when you take this to like the multiplayer or the campaigns, or let's take a look even at like Far Cry, there's a lot of times where you're locked into your iron sights and you'll get killed by an enemy that's like on your peripherals, or there's an explosion or something that happens, and the game needs to rely on a lot of these weird annoying HUD elements like grenade markers or pop-ups on your screen, and it just clutters and distracts from the gameplay. Like I always say, or I always think that when a game needs to hit you with like 12 different pop-ups, it means it's not doing a good job at communicating through its actual gameplay and art style and sound design and the like. And I feel like the kind of mainstream Iron Sights gameplay kind of plays into that. Like, again, I'm not saying that Iron Sights are a bad thing, I'm just saying that when you're using Iron Sights in a video game, you need to really balance the game around that. And in something that's as erratic as Far Cry, having to go into your iron sights can really fuck you up unless you have all those really annoying HUD things turned on. A game that uses iron sights much better, or a series I would say, is probably the Metal Gear series. You see, Metal Gear is not primarily a shooter. Metal Gear is a stealth game, which means that the majority of the time when you're going in to shoot at someone, they're unaware of your presence, which means you can get into those iron sights and you can get hyper-focused on a given enemy, making sure you land that perfect shot in the head, or the leg, or the arm, or the heart, or the balls, like wherever you're aiming, you know? It's not going to be like in Far Cry where, Snake's going down his iron sights and all of a sudden there's a tiger that attacks him from the right, 3 explosions that happen behind him, and an off-screen sniper enemy that's going to kill him. Like, Metal Gear does a much better job at telegraphing when you should run and when you can actually take the time to use your weapons and get into those sights. And I feel like the Metal Gear games, the older ones like 2 and Snake Eater, which I still hold to be the peak of the franchise, to be the best usage of this, because those games don't have reticles. A lot of third-person shooters use reticles, first-person shoot, like a lot of games use reticles, and again, I feel like they're not necessarily a bad thing, but there's something really special about Metal Gear when I have like this full awareness where I'm not focused on this center point that's in my screen during combat. I'm transitioning between melee combat. I'm transitioning between, shooting, taking my time to shoot, spray and praying. There's certain weapons that are made to just be like hip fired. Take Snake Eater's shotgun, for example. That's a great example of a weapon where when I'm running around during an alert, I don't have to think too much or stop to really use it effectively. But then you take something like the M16, and that's a weapon that really excels in those stealthy or long range segments where I can really take my time to aim and use those iron sights. But going back to reticles, when we start talking about reticles, we have this idea of bloom. Now, I never really thought much of bloom. Again, I grew up playing Halo Combat Evolved the majority of the time, and then I moved on to shooters where I turned off the reticles because I could use my iron sights like Far Cry. But it's only recently I started thinking about bloom as a means of balancing, and this was mostly because of Resident Evil 4. You see, in Resident Evil 4, it tries to give you this whole weird pistol sandbox where each pistol has like a unique kind of gimmick to it, so they're all supposed to be equally viable. And the Resident Evil 4 remake furthers this by having only certain pistols be able to attach laser sights. Now, we haven't really talked much about laser sights, but I really like laser sights, and I feel like there's a lot that games can do with laser sights when it comes to balancing for the sake of like accuracy, you know? There's a lot of people that are gonna say, oh, but laser sights aren't really practical. And it's like, guess what, buddy? The Spaz 12 isn't practical either, but you see that in video games a lot too. But it's specifically from the lens of balancing, laser sights are cool because they can give certain guns that don't have really good accuracy when it comes to their reticle and the bloom that you get from it, and make them a really accurate tool. Like laser sights work as a really good upgrade. Or in Resident Evil 4's case, when you have a gun that's really weak, like the Punisher, the laser sight acts as a really good buff to make it more viable. But then you have a gun like the Blacktail that uses a reticle but has no bloom, which means that it's ridiculously accurate, which kind of nullifies this whole laser upgrade. Like Resident Evil 4 Remake's balancing is very wishy-washy with a couple of choices like this, but it really goes to show the importance of bloom when you're using it in a sandbox that has aiming dependent on reticles. Because if you all of a sudden have one gun that doesn't have bloom, that reticle is going to be so much more powerful. A much better example of a well-balanced game that uses laser sights as a really good upgrade to certain weapons that suffer from bloom would be Left 4 Dead 2. The AK and laser sight combo is legendary for a reason. Now, normally when you get the AK, you'll switch it out for other assault rifles because they have less bloom, have more ammo, and are more accurate. But the AK has this outstanding damage. So when you get it, and you're seeing how good it is, but then you have like the issues with distance and accuracy, it's always a bit of a bummer when you have to put it down and swap it out for something else. But when you get the laser sight, all of a sudden you have this weapon that's really powerful, and that original detriment of having that bloom mess with your accuracy is gone now that you have an effective means of aiming through this laser. Again, I really wish more games did this. Of course, there's areas where I don't really like seeing bloom. For example, Halo Reach uses bloom. It's totally not necessary for Halo. I acknowledge how bloom can be used for balancing in other games. I mean, we just talked about Resident Evil 4, and we just talked about Left 4 Dead 2. However, in Halo, a lot of the guns are already distinctive enough and have their own unique quirky balancings that you don't need to have bloom. So for example, if we take a game like Call of Duty, you have the AK-74 and then you have a AUG. And to make them feel different, you might have the bloom and recoil be adjusted differently, even if it doesn't reflect how that works in real life, right? You use that bloom to differentiate the two weapons. But then in Halo, again, let's look at that plasma rifle and assault rifle. There's already a world of difference in these weapons. Because it's a sci-fi game, you can make these weapons do wacky specific things. The plasma rifle strips shields, it stuns enemies. The assault rifle covers a wide area and is really good for thinning out weaker crowds. It doesn't need bloom to make the weapons special or balance them. And it especially makes no sense when you have Halo Reach and you have bloom in a scoped weapon. The whole idea of a scope is that you're supposed to completely give up your peripheral awareness and mobility, but you get that accuracy. So when you add bloom into a scoped weapon, it's kind of defeating the point of a scope, you know? I mean, like, one of the best weapons in Halo Reach is the grenade launcher, and that's because it focuses in on those weird kind of sci-fi balancings, rather than having bloom and other gimmicky stuff that a shooter like COD or something else based in realism would have to rely on. So for games like Halo or Resident Evil 4, whether it's using a reticle in Halo's case or always using laser sights or scopes in the original Resident Evil 4's case, having that consistent, stable aiming makes sense and works really well for the style of gameplay those games are trying to go for. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't just include something because other games are doing it, sort of thing. The last form of aiming I want to talk about that we've kind of touched upon already is that kind of auto-locking system, or that aim assist. Again, Metal Gear is a cool example of this, where you have weapons that are designed to work while you're just traversing the world without really taking the time to aim them. Snake Eater's shotgun, or in Metal Gear Solid 2, how the weapons have an aggressive aim lock on whenever you're firing in the normal dynamic camera system without actually going into your sights. But probably the best example of this would be in the older Resident Evil games. Using the shotgun feels really good. Getting a headshot on multiple different zombies by lining it up in the general direction and just waiting until they're close enough feels very satisfying. You don't have to go into your sights, you don't have to go behind the character's shoulder, it just feels visceral. You still feel in control because you see exactly what your character is doing with the weapon, and you see exactly the scene of the zombies coming at you. There's something to be said for this kind of classic design, and I really want to bring it up as a valid form of aiming. And I guess we're kind of going to get something like this with the Snake Eater remake, including a control scheme and camera system very similar to the original. So yeah, those are the 4 different kinds of aiming I really see in games. You have your iron sights, you have your reticles, you have your lasers, and you have your auto-aim systems. Of course, scopes kind of fit into all of these styles of systems just because it's such a unique means of balancing a weapon like a sniper. But those are the 4 ways of just general aiming, outside of specialized weapons. Again, I feel like each and every one of these aiming systems has their validity and has something to add, but I really think that a lot of games just kind of do things that are trendy. Far Cry does not need a reticle. Halo does not need bloom. So I wanted to make this video just to, get you guys to think about the games you're playing. When you're playing a game that's a shooter or a game that isn't a shooter but has shooting in it, just notice the different ways that developers can uniquely handle the idea of aiming and how that affects the game overall. Because at the end of the day, I feel like that's what this channel is really about. Just getting people to think about the games they play in a unique way, kind of pulling back the curtain and seeing how these certain decisions that passionate, talented people have made when putting these games together have affected the experiences that you and I enjoy or that you and I really don't enjoy. So yeah, let me know what is your favorite game when it comes to aiming. I want you to get specific in those comments. Anyways, this has been Pliskin Boy. Over and out.
This is Solid Snake. Hey, subscribe to Pliskin Boy. God damn it.
You heard him.